Alex. Arrivederci. Buenos dias.
Hey,
Guten Tag.
Kelly.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. I'm super stoked. I have a person today that I think fits right in our wheelhouse, and is somebody also that I feel like, I don't know, it's just this sort of mythical person that I had heard the name many times, but really didn't know much about before. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, we always say the wheelhouse is people that is kind of universally known. Most people just know of just a thumbnail, could give you maybe one or two words, and then not really any history on the person.
Yeah. Well, this guy did a lot. He is not our 20th century hero. Like, we like those 20th century guys, but this guy was actually born in 1254.
Whoa,
Yeah.
1254.
Pretty far back. He was also born in the same town as our pal Casanova. Remember where that was?
Wow. It was, the town itself? I don't.
Well, same place, Venice.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and it wasn't Italy. Remember, it was
it was his own thing.
Unincorporated Venice. Yeah,
It was its own thing back then. Venetian.
You wonder how accurate 1254 is too. When it was that long ago, if it was around 1254.
Well, it is interesting because it in my research it is stated that they don't know, or it's not known the day he was born. They're pretty sure on the year, but it's not known the day. But they know they're pretty sure on the day he died, but not the day he was born. But I guess when you're a baby and you're being born in 1254 in Venice, who cares, right?
Yeah, the 1250s were not as great as the 1260s.
Well, they got more into that hippie thing in the 1260s, right?
Yeah.
1250s was all about bebop and diners and soda fountains.
Really, it's anything over like before like 1750 is all the same to me.
Well, this is a little different, I think, because this guy had a nickname, and his nickname was Milione.
Milione. Okay. Does that mean like millionaire?
It means million. He was an explorer. And he explored the Far East. All right. And he has a lot of things named after him, but probably the thing that you're going to be the most familiar with is a game you play in the swimming pool.
Yeah. I was just going to say. Marco Polo.
Marco
Polo.
So it's interesting how that game came to be, but I want to save that for the end. Talk about him, and then I'll tell you about that game at the end.
Marco Polo.
Marco Polo was born in Venice, and he was Venetian. And what's interesting, he did not know his father, who he ended up traveling with for a long time, or his uncle, because his father was away when he was born. As a matter of fact, his father's first trip to the Far East, where he traveled through Asia. This is his father, Nicola, and his uncle, Maffeo. They traveled for, I believe, 17 years or maybe it was even like 16, 15 years, a long time, like more than 10 years. They took this trip. And while they were gone, Marco was born. And while they were gone, Marco's mother died. So Nicola returned to find his wife dead. He's got a 15-year-old son who he's never met before, because the son was born. Maybe that was the night he said goodbye to his wife, and never met her, or never met him, Marco. And so he's got this 15-year-old son. He comes back. He's done some pretty big things. As a matter of fact, he met Kublai Khan. Nicola did in Asia, and he had promised Kublai Khan he would come back to the East after returning to Venice, because Kublai Khan was actually very interested in religion. He was very interested in Christians. He was interested in the politics and the the monarchy and the hierarchy of Europe at the time. You know the group that Kublai Khan was the leader of. Have you heard what they're called?
No.
The Mongols.
I actually was going to guess that, but I was afraid to be.
No, it was the Mongols. And so Kublai Khan was the grandson of Genghis Khan. You've probably heard of Genghis Khan, right?
Yeah.
The Khan basically means king. And so Kubla was, and it's spelled actually Kublia, I believe. Mm-hmm. They were also called the Tartars. Have you heard of
Tartars,
that?
Yeah.
And you know why we have steak tartare? Have you ever heard of steak tartare?
Yeah. It's like raw steak, basically. Yeah.
Well, it is, but that's because the Mongols would cook their steak by putting it under the saddle or the blanket on their horse, and the horse's heat as it rode would cook the meat.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's different than the Mongolian barbecue that I'm used to.
And it was salted as well. As a matter of fact, the Mongols were they were
innovative.
They were innovative, you know, and they were very much they were the boogeymen of Europe at the time. Everybody was afraid of them because they were so fierce. They didn't take prisoners. They generally would ravage. It's actually said that at one point they had wiped out 10% of the world's population.
Yeah,
the Mongols had. And
I've heard that just about everybody on Earth is related to Genghis Khan. Somehow.
Well, so we're cousins with Kubla. Yeah. So the Mongols terrified the Westerners, but somehow Marco's dad, Nicola, and his uncle Maffeo made a good impression on Kublai Khan, and he sent them back to Venice to kind of check in with things. But they were also supposed to bring back a couple of things. So they wanted Kublai Khan wanted them to bring back a note from the Pope. He was very interested. Unfortunately, while they were in Venice, the Pope died, and it took like 2 years for them to name a new Pope. So that was a difficult thing for them to do because they were waiting for this new Pope to be named. The other thing he wanted, and they did bring back to him when they went back, and they went back with Marco, by the way, who was aged like 15 at the time. They wanted him to bring back Kublai Khan wanted them to bring back sacred oil from the sepulcher where Jesus is said to be buried. There's oil there that is supposed to be like have a healing thing. It's interesting too that the Mongols, while they were vicious and they were considered kind of really, really tough warriors and wiped out entire countries and groups of people, they were also very tolerant of other religions. Within the Mongol Empire, there were Christians, there were Jews, there were Muslims, there were Buddhists, and the Mongols found it easier to not try and impart their religion on people that they conquered.
So these people were in what's now like mainland China, right?
They were in Mongolia, what would be considered Mongolia, and I believe China was east of them, like was even further east. The interesting thing about where Kublai Khan was located and where Marco Polo traveled to was it was kind of all over the East. He went to Vietnam, what would today be Vietnam, what would today be different parts of China. And China is such a huge landmass, right? It's a really big landmass. So it was a very large area. But the big thing that Kublai Khan was able to keep going was trade. Because he ruled and everybody was a little bit afraid of him, they had developed this trade route through the Far East called the Silk Road. And I think today, we had, I don't know if it still exists anymore because I think it got shut down by the FBI, but Silk Road was a place to buy illegal stuff online, right?
So yeah, that sounds, I think I've heard of that. So how far was this trip? How many miles are we talking
well,
here?
Well, it was said that according to It was thousands, like halfway around the globe, basically. So if the globe, I don't know what the circumference of the globe is, like 14,000 miles or something. So it was 7,000 miles. It was said that by the time Marco returned to Venice, he had traveled like 15,000 miles or something. He had documented.
It just takes years off your life. So he left when he was 15, and by the time he got there, he was probably 18.
He came. He was actually 21 when he finally met Kublai Khan. And when he returned to Venice, he was in his 30s. But I want to tell you a couple more things about the Mongols, because they're really interesting people. They were, again, they terrified Westerners. They were kind of fearless, and they were very good on horses. They were very good archers. They could come in and just rain down arrows on people and then run you over with their horse. They also had this relationship with their horse where they cooked their meat by putting it under the saddle or under a blanket. They also drank the milk of a mare. So they all rode mares, and they would take the milk that the mare would have, and they would ferment it, and it was called kumas. And it was a big delicacy there, and it was supposed to be really terrible.
I'm still can't get past the hairy food.
Well, okay. And then here's the real clincher. When they had to, because they were traveling such great distances, sometimes they wouldn't eat for a while. They would make a small cut in the horse or camel they were riding's veins and suck their blood out because it had nutrition in it.
That is pretty gangster, isn't it?
It is gangster at the top of the list. So no wonder everybody was terrified of them. But Kublai Khan, he was very taken with these three European traders. As a matter of fact, the Polos, they called them the Polo Company. They were actually called the Merchants of Venice. You've maybe heard that term.
Yeah, I think that was a musical or something.
They were called the Merchants of Venice. Kublai Khan was taken with them. He was really taken with Marco. And when Marco arrived, he treated them very well to the point where he gave them a passport that allowed them to travel all over his kingdoms. And his kingdoms were very far-reaching. So this was something that was inscribed onto gold, and it would allow them to pass not only without harm, but if they were coming through, the people were obligated to take care of the Polos as they came through these areas. And a lot of these areas were pretty dangerous.
And Polo was actually their last name, or was that kind of like okay?
No, it was Nicola and Maffeo and Marco Polo, and that was actually their last name.
It's a good name.
It is
Marco Polo. I mean, that's a good name.
Well, so they actually their home in Venice was called Coppola or Copolo. Ca was actually an abbreviated version of casa, or I'm saying it like Spanish, but in Italian, casa meant home, and so Ca Pola was the home of polo. Not related to the game of polo, by the way. I don't think.
You don't think?
I never saw anything about that, but
or Ralph Lauren's polo.
they had no relation to Ralph Lauren, although they did trade in silks. And
I was going to say, when I picture Marco Polo, he's always wearing a collared shirt.
He was a very fashionable guy.
His golf shirt. That's what I'm picturing.
Yeah, with a little horse on it, and the horse has a little cut in its neck where they suck the blood, and maybe the teats of a mare where it would give its milk.
You're talking about a logo redesign that I'm all in favor of.
Yes, come on, Polo. You should sponsor us and let us do your thing. Well, so he's 15, 16 years old. Never met his father. Was actually raised by his aunt and uncle because his mother had died. He had gotten a pretty good education, and they were all considered. The Polos were considered merchants, right? That was their thing. They were traders. They would go to places. They would trade in precious jewels. And one of the tricks that they did was they never carried cash, or they tried very, very hard not to carry cash, but they carried gems and rubies and diamonds. And they would, how they would protect them from getting stolen? they would sew them into their garment.
Oh.
So they had cloaks, and they would sew them into the cloaks, and they were robbed many times, and that would kind of save them from losing their most precious stuff.
So they'd pack their stuff, and it would be sewn into their packed clothes. Are you talking about the clothes they were wearing?
No, the clothes they were wearing, because usually their bags would get stolen. So
But why wouldn't people just rip their clothes off then?
Maybe they were stupid and didn't know.
Indecent.
Yeah. Sir, give me everything you have, but you can keep that fine cloak. It's cold out here.
So there was like kind of blinged out their clothes.
No, but they were hidden. No. They wanted the clothes to look as
they sewed them inside, like you couldn't see them.
Yeah. Not I'm not talking bedazzled or what are those things called when you bejeweled. They were sewn inside and hidden in such a way that you couldn't really see it. So they arrived, after they had returned. So after his uncle and father returned to Nicola and Maffeo, returned after their time, the first time, they took Marco with them, and they arrived back in 1270. Well, they left in 1271, and they traveled until about 1275. So it took them about 4 years to get there. And by the time they finally got there, so have you ever heard like of Cathay Pacific or Cathay Airlines?
Yeah, Cathay, yeah.
You know what that's from?
Is that what they called that area? Is China?
Yes. China was known by Westerners as Cathay.
Got it.
I don't know why, but
Cathay, yeah.
Yeah, Cathay. So by the time they reached Cathay, or it was Chengdu, China, is where Kublai Khan's palace was. Marco was introduced, and first of all, his father and uncle scored big by bringing the oil from the sepulcher. That was a huge win for them. Kublai Khan was very impressed by that.
It was just a little sample of the oil.
I don't know how much it was, but apparently they had to give a big offering in order to get it, and it had taken a while to get it, but it was huge, and it kind of endeared them. Kublai Khan had also asked them to bring 100 wise men with them back from like Europe.
Literally 100.
Yeah, he wanted 100
people.
wise men, but they didn't do that. But the offering of the oil was big, and also basically Nicola offered Marco to be a servant of Kublai Khan. He said, "I offer my son as a servant." So,
oh, geez.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that was something that was expected or not expected, but apparently it was okay because with that, Kublai Khan was taken by Marco in that he liked Marco's humility, he liked his style, he liked his intelligence, and so he made him an emissary. And what that meant was he sent Marco Polo all over Asia to travel his empire and gather information for him. That was Marco's job, was to travel around and gather information for Kublai Khan. And so Marco did that for years and years. I think it was 24 years that he actually was gone.
Think about it, though. Back then, the West and the East, just broadly speaking, Europe and Asia, were fascinated with each other because they just had different foods and different spices and different jewels, and those trade routes that opened up really gave themselves access to this whole new world that they didn't have access to. And they were all fascinated with each other.
Well, and I think one of the themes that I learned was Kublai Khan was as fascinated by the West as the East or as the West was fascinated by the East.
Sure.
And of him. Although I think everybody was terrified of him. Everybody thought that Kublai Khan was, a murderous guy. And he was maybe on a macro level, when it came to like ruling and big picture. But it's interesting you said, the trade routes that opened up and things like that. What actually happened years later, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but it's relevant to this, is that once Kublai Khan was not in charge anymore, a lot of those trade routes actually collapsed, and you couldn't travel between all these countries because they were, instead of being unified under Kublai Khan, they became factions, and they were fighting so much that you couldn't travel from one area to another. There was a period of time after Kublai Khan that the trade routes actually kind of dried up.
So because of like pirates and barbarians and
more because of fighting between the different factions of people, that lived in these areas. They didn't have one common ruler anymore. That was kind of, I mean, imagine if the U.S. every state broke into its own thing, how much fighting there would be between the states.
So you're saying you could literally make the trip, but there was nobody to trade with.
You could make the trip, but it was much more dangerous because you were going, if you were going from Texas to Louisiana, the Louisianans didn't like the Texans, and the Texans didn't like the Louisianans, and so they might cut your head off.
Yeah, okay.
Whereas when Kublai Khan was around, everybody was under him and afraid of him, and so they kind of kept law and order. It was a little bit of a law and order by fear, I guess, rule by fear.
Different time back then.
But they spent, as I said, 24 years. They ended up returning around 1295 back to Venice. Now, before they were able to go back to Venice, they actually had asked to go back on more than one occasion. They didn't want to stay that long, but Kublai Khan refused. He liked having them there. He liked having all three of them, the uncle, the father, and Marco, and would send them on these trips. He felt like they were very good at what they did. They were good emissaries. They were good at observing. They were good at note-taking as they traveled. They were respected in his court. And so finally what allowed them to return home was in 1291, he granted them permission to escort his a Mongol princess named Kokochin. It's either Kokochin or Kokochin. She was to be escorted and become the bride of another Khan in another region in Persia. And so they escorted her. They traveled to Constantinople, and they ended up staying with her for like 3 years. This trip took 3 years. She didn't want them to leave because she was being married off to somebody she'd never met before, and she basically told them, please stay. Finally, so that was in 1291 when they left. Finally, in 1295, they made their way back to Venice after traveling 15,000 miles.
That's crazy. That's so many miles.
So they get back to Venice, and guess who Venice is in a fight with? Genoa, the Genoese, which I guess is now also part of Italy, right?
Right, yeah.
So they're in a fight. The Polos return to their home. They're able to convert their gemstones and the things they had brought back into quite a bit of money. And so they've become wealthier. They've become more of the aristocrats of Venice at the time. Well, Marco Polo decides in 1295 that he's going to help in the war, and he ends up selling some of his gems so that they can buy trebuchets and weapons to fight the Genoans. Well, he not only does that, he also accompanies the Venetians out on a ship as part of this war, and he's aboard the ship when there is a battle, and he ends up getting captured by the Genoese and ends up in Genoese jail, and it is there that he decides to write his memoir. Now, because he was upper class, and more of a statesman or a gentleman, the jails apparently treated him fairly well. Like he didn't have some of the hardships that some of the other prisoners had. He had spare time, and so he met this other inmate who was named Rusticello. Have you heard of Rusticello?
No.
Kind of a famous name. Rusticello was a writer, and he basically ghost writ Marco's book for him, and it was called The Travels of Marco Polo, and the Italian name was The Million, and that was because of his nickname as The Million. Now, why they called him the Million was under debate, but the main reason that he came to be known as the Million was because his stories about the Far East were always on such a high scale, like it was always millions. It was never 1,000 or 100. It was millions,
Yeah.
So the stories were very fantastic. And so
would he embellish his stories, or he just
you hit the nail on the head. So this book, the Travels of Marco Polo, got translated from Venetian into Latin, and then from Latin got translated into other languages. Marco ends up getting released in 1299. So that was, after several years in prison from the Genoese. I guess the war ended. He got released. And yeah, that was a big debate about that book, about how much of it he made up, because some historians referred to things that he would have seen, like, for instance, paper money. Nobody was using paper money at that time except in China, right? So that was something he referenced, which is said to be accurate, because that was something that the Europeans weren't doing. They had coins and they had gold, but they didn't have paper.
Well, it's funny too. Verbal storytelling, you're just telling stories around the campfire, just, shooting the breeze with your friends. It's okay if you make some stuff up, especially if you're talking about traveling 15,000 miles and meeting Kubla Khan and all that. You can throw in, and the idea that his nickname was a Million kind of tells you that he boasts, exaggerates. Historians, though, hundreds of years later, aren't okay with that. 1,000 years later, aren't okay with that, because they're trying to figure out what happened.
Even in short term, like even in the 13 and 1400s, historians, like, people were questioning, like they would get really deep. And this is where this podcast could be 2 hours long, but I cut some of it back down. But they argued things like, he never mentions the Great Wall of China. Well, when was the Great Wall of China built, and what part of China was he in? Would he have seen it if parts of it were built? There was all that discussion. But then there were things, like I said, about paper money that he talks about. He talked about things like, there were so many things. Let me see here.
Because he was one of the few people to make that trip. And here he is just kind of making stuff up. That's pretty funny. I'm all for it, though.
He talked about burning of coal, which wasn't something that they did a lot back then. Now, he did actually learn to speak the local language. I don't know if it was Chinese or what it was considered at that time. He, before that, also had spoke, like French and Viennese and maybe Italian. I mean, he spoke several languages, so he was a good communicator. But really, the question comes down to a couple things. Number one, he had this guy ghostwriting for him, right? And supposedly the guy who was ghostwriting, who was in prison with him, was someone who had written adventure stories before, and had written stories more in line with fiction. Rusticello had written these fiction stories, so he had actually maybe embellished as he was writing to make the story more exciting.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. He didn't know that people were going to use it like for history.
And then the second thing was the translations had to happen. So, right, if it was originally done in Viennese, and then it had to be translated to Latin, and then it had to be translated to French, and it had to be translated to English, and it had to be translated every time. Well, and also this was before the printing press. So every copy of this book was handwritten. So imagine if you're handwriting this book, you might shorten some things just
Sure.
for your own sake,
So every version might be a little bit different.
Every version was different. As a matter of fact, it said there is no real knowledge of what the original book was. Nobody has copy number 1 of this book. It doesn't exist. But you know who did carry a copy of this book?
Who?
Christopher Columbus.
Oh.
And not only, I think that copy of it,
years later, right?
I think that copy of it, 1492, that copy of it still exists. And it has, Christopher Columbus wrote notes in the side of it, because he was going, and the reason he was carrying it is because he was going to try and find the East.
Yeah, he was using it like a travel log.
Yes, absolutely. He actually didn't expect to bump into North America. He thought he was going to end up in China and was going to meet the descendants of Kublai Khan and have this book and be able to, kind of use it as a guide. But, that all went south.
Yeah.
A few other things from the book that were interesting was some descriptions that Marco Polo had. He described a large sack-shaped light in the sky with a long silk tail behind it. Can you imagine what that would have been in the sky?
Like Halley's Comet?
A comet, yeah. At one point he described that. He also described animals that were had like unicorns. He talked about some horses that supposedly had horns. He talked about a certain kind of sheep.
What were
As
those?
a matter of fact, what's
like
that?
Oryx or something, or like
it's unknown. It's unknown. The sheep, however, actually are now known as Marco Polo sheep. Are
you serious?
Yeah, there is a breed of sheep in Asia called the Marco Polo.
Like bighorn, like some kind of bighorn sheep in the mountains.
It was something. And even though there were omissions, he didn't ever mention, like, some of the omissions that he didn't talk about were tea. He didn't talk about the importance of tea in their culture, which people think is kind of weird. Like tea that you drink.
Yeah, but if I wrote a book, I wouldn't talk about tea either. I don't like tea.
But here's the thing: is Marco Polo was not the first European to travel over there. He was just the first person to write a book about it.
Okay.
And that really became kind of the basic reason that he was considered the authority.
Have you read any parts of that book?
Only excerpts that were online.
Like, is it compelling? Is it good? Is it gripping?
So supposedly it was, pretty difficult to read initially because it had so much detail, and it wasn't really a story. It was more just a descriptions of things. And then it was also written out of order. And there is some thought that he didn't actually, like, the concept of time, the beginning, middle, and end. If he went to a place, he only mentioned it once in the book, as if the 3 or 4 times he went there was one time. So I think it was kind of hard to read, but there was an English translation that was done not too long ago that actually supposedly made it easier to read. Like, kind of took all of the versions that were known, because there were different versions of it that were published, and made it. Well, it was in 1938. There was a version that was done, and it was translated into English, and that one was supposedly translated from a close to original manuscript, and that the versions prior to 1938, in the early 1900s and 1800s, had been pretty far off from what that original was.
I wonder why the ghostwriter. Why Rusconi? Is that his name?
What was his name? Not Ruscitello.
I thought you said Rusconi.
No. Yeah, I forget what his name was. But I think at the time, writing was a very unknown art. Like, something that even if you were literate and you could read, you couldn't necessarily. Rustichello da Pisa, from Pisa.
So you wonder, maybe he was the one that embellished the stuff too.
Yeah, and people think he did. People think he did, because he was a writer of adventure stories, and so it'd be like when you and I have our book written to have somebody famous do it. So let's say we get J.K. Rowling to write our book, and then all of a sudden there's wizards and witches, and we're like, wait, okay, go with it. It's good.
Yeah. But what if his stories were boring and like nothing happened?
Well, I mean, some of the things, again, had to do with the creatures that lived there. He did talk a lot about the customs of marriage and kind of sex, and what people could and couldn't do, and how they were a lot more open with their relationships over there, and that was kind of fascinating to him. So he talked a lot about that. Now, remember, he was 15 when he left on this trip, and arrived at 21. So I think he ended up becoming pretty fascinated with the women of the Far East and the way they, the way they would supposedly, if you were a traveler and there was either a married woman whose husband was gone or an unmarried woman, they would take you in.
Right. Yeah.
At the time.
Right. Yeah. This is all covered in that Shogun. Have you ever seen the Shogun?
I haven't, but okay. So that was a custom
similar.
that they did then.
Yeah.
The other big thing that he influenced was maps. So at the time of then, there weren't many maps drawn of that region, especially in the West, right? The West didn't have very many maps of the East. And so he didn't necessarily draw maps, but he described things, and maps were drawn from those descriptions, including even some accounts of like the west coast of Alaska, which, nobody had discovered at that point. Yeah. But maps of Japan, Siberia, Alaska, things like that were things that Marco Polo influenced. Now, there is a myth that he brought pasta.
I was going to ask you about that. Everyone, when they say spaghetti, there's always some wise guy that always has to tell you spaghetti was actually come from China. Is that not true?
It is not true. There already was pasta in Europe at the time. And supposedly that was made up by a marketing company to help sell Marco Polo pasta.
Oh, that was a brand of pasta?
I don't know if it was called Marco Polo, but there was apparently a trade magazine called the Macaroni Journal. Did you subscribe to the Macaroni Journal?
No, but I'm sure our guy Chef Boyardee did.
Did you see what they wrote in the journal? Yeah, it was basically a way of promoting pasta to say that it was brought back by him, because it wasn't.
It wasn't.
No.
Wow, all this time.
No. Now, a few other things that you might know about Marco Polo. He was his face was on has been on the Italian money in the past.
Like the lira that they used to have?
Yep. There is, as I said, the Marco Polo sheep, which is a subspecies of Ovis aemon, which was named after him because he discovered it kind of in the West. There was a 3-mast ship built in 1851 in New Brunswick that was the first ship to travel around the world in less than 6 months in 1851, called the Marco Polo. Mm-hmm. If you fly into Venice, the airport is called the Venice Marco Polo Airport.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. We talked earlier about Cathay Pacific, the airline. Their frequent flyer program is called the Marco Polo Club. Mm. And then, of course, movies. Lots of TV shows, board games.
Board games?
Yeah, there was a board game called The Voyages of Marco Polo that was made in 1977.
Was that a Milton Bradley?
I think it's a Mattel jam. I don't know. It could be Milton Bradley. I didn't say, but there was also an episode of Doctor Who in the 60s where Doctor Who actually meets Marco Polo.
Of course.
Yeah. And then I thought this was kind of cool. And this is, of all these, this is one I kind of want to see. In 2009, there was a documentary on PBS called The Footsteps of Marco Polo. And it was about two friends who take a road trip to retrace his journey from Venice to China.
Oh man, I was going to suggest we do that and film it. It's already been done.
Well, we can watch what they did and make it better. And then of course Netflix, and I only found this out recently, from 2014 to 2016 there was a drama series called Marco Polo's it's called Marco Polo.
Yeah, that's what I would call it too.
So now if you stuck around this long, I'm sure you were just waiting for this moment. The question everybody wants to know.
The swimming pool game.
Yeah, where did it...
Now, I must confess, I don't even think I know how to play Marco Polo. Like, I know it involves dunking people in a pool. and
Okay.
somebody says Marco, and then somebody like, I don't even know how to play.
So it's like blind man's bluff. Blind man's bluff. You're basically blindfolded, or you close your eyes, and you have to catch other people. And if you catch them, they become the blind man, and they have to catch you. But you catch them through a call and repeat of Marco and Polo. And then if somebody gets out of the pool, and you can somehow you can somehow get them and tell them they were out of the pool, and they become the blind man. So it's just a really simple game. Something where you learn, I mean, for little kids, they're learning about like how to find things with their ears instead of their eyes. They're learning about call and repeat. It's kind of a call and repeat, or a call and answer. I say Marco, you say Polo. But supposedly the origin of it, there's several different stories about how it came to be. But the one I liked the best was about Marco Polo was lost in the desert when he was traveling in China. And there are these things called the singing sands. And this is actually a real thing in the desert, where the wind will whip up the sand and it will make a noise that sounds like a human voice. And he thought he heard people calling his name, and he was calling back with his last name, I guess. I don't know why you would do that, but it was the singing sands in the desert.
There's no way this is true, but I love it.
Well, I mean, the singing sands are a thing, actually.
No, there's no way that's why we have the swimming pool game.
Oh, well.
But
okay.
I love it. I like that story.
Yeah, so supposedly it came from the singing sands. The other variations on that story was that he was on a ship, and they were lost in the fog, and same thing. People were calling out to him, trying to find him in the fog, and call and repeat. So
it's crazy though that like that lasted like 1,000 years. That came to swimming pools in the suburbs in the 80s.
Yeah. I mean, it's been around for a long time now. The last thing I want to tell you about Marco Polo that I think might blow your mind. So you and I went to San Antonio, and we saw Primus, a band that we, respect, do an entire Rush album, including the song Xanadu.
Xanadu, right.
So here's what's wild about that. The song includes lyrics from a poem written by a guy named Samuel Taylor Coleridge.
Right. Xanadu did Kubla Khan, right? That one?
Yes. And it's actually called Kubla Khan. Or there's an alternate, it's called A Vision in a Dream, a Fragment. That's the other part. So do you know anything about how that poem was written?
No, I think I looked it up right around that time whenever I think about Xanadu, I look it up and then I forget instantly.
So Samuel Taylor Coleridge was reading a book, but he was also high on opium. So he had taken some opium supposedly for a medical reason. There was something he had something, they didn't have any leeches available, so he took some opium instead. Mm-hmm. And he was reading this book called Purchase, His Pilgrims, or Relations of the World and Religions Observed in All Ages and Places Discovered, from the creation to the present. I'm not done with the title.
Oh, geez.
From the creation to the present, and it was written by the English clergyman named Samuel Purchase in 1613. That book contained a description of Xanadu, which was actually the summer palace of Kubla Khan, and that description came from Marco Polo.
Of being this just like almost a mythical palace with magical stuff.
Well, I mean, I think part of that was the fact that he was high on opium at the time.
Sure.
But the book that was written by this guy Purchas, Purchas, and then translated into a poem or interpreted into a poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Originally, he had talked about a large palace made of gilded and lacquered cane and bamboo, which could be taken apart and moved. So Xanadu was actually sort of a mobile palace that could be taken from place to place. And this sumptuous house of pleasure that was mentioned by Purchas was transformed into a stately pleasure dome. And the dome part comes from the fact that the canes and the bamboo that were bent served as the roof, and they were kind of bent into a dome shape.
Do you have that line that in Xanadu did Kubla Khan? What's the line?
Held within the pleasure dome, decreed by Kubla Khan, to taste anew my mortal life. I actually looked up the entire poem, but the last line is, "For I have dined on honeydew and drank the milk of paradise," and a lot of that is straight out of the poem. Like you know the song "Limelight" by Rush.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's taken from Shakespeare. But not exactly word for word. The song has some changes to it, as does Xanadu by Rush, but traced back through this Purchas guy and then back through our boy, the opium guy, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So yeah, that's Marco Polo. Explorer, again, not the first to explore the Far East, but the first to really write about it. And write it with a lot of detail. And again, he spent 20-something years there. So he did know the place pretty well. He was very respected. They were actually, when they were released to escort the niece of Kublai Khan to get married, you know, that's kind of how they got released. They were supposed to come back. They were actually made to promise to come back. But then Kublai Khan died. And then what happened after that, there was a period of time afterward where you couldn't travel on the Silk Road. You couldn't go to the Far East because when Kublai Khan died, everything kind of fractioned and people became, they went to war. And there were so many wars going on that it was much less safe to travel without Kublai Khan.
Wow. Well, you love the explorers. You seem to be fascinated with people that just leave their homes and say, I'm going to dip out for like 10 years. I'm going to walk around the world and then I'll be back. Whether it's
Johnny Appleseed,
or
Shackleton.
You love these guys that have wanderlust.
I do. Yeah. And it was certainly, it's funny because most of what I was reading about this it's almost like that song Tribute by Tenacious D. It wasn't the book of Marco Polo's travels. It was about the book of Marco Polo's travels, right?
Exactly.
It's like, okay, what was actually in the book? Well, there was some stuff about some unicorns and a comet and paper money and concubines, but you know, not a lot of detail in it. But,
too bad he didn't have Geddy Lee as his actual ghostwriter,
or Neil Peart, because then he would have got a really great drum solo out of it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's Kublai Khan. We talked a lot about Kublai Khan, and maybe I should do an episode about him at some point, but that was Marco Polo. Next time you dive in the pool, think of us, and be sure to listen every week to Dirt Nap City, where we talk about interesting dead people.
Marco
Polo.
Yeah. Marco Polo sailed seas, met Kublai Khan. Now kids and pools got me feeling like a pawn. Exploring Asia, yeah, that's what he did. But played a game, sounded foolish with the lid. Marco Polo, yeah, the real OG. In a pool blindfold, ain't what he see. Kids splashing, laughing, calling out his name. Bet he think it's just a swimming chain. Cross silk roads with tails so bold. Now in swim trunks, story been sold. Catching spices, silk and gold from afar. Now blindfolded in water, can't see no Marco Polo, yeah, the real OG. In a pool blindfold, ain't what he see. Kids splashing, laughing, calling out his name. Bet he think it's just a swimming chain. Led us to the con, adventure so wild. Now it's Marco Polo, games of a child. Navigated oceans with compass in hand. Now shouting underwater, can't understand. Marco Polo, yeah, the real OG. In a pool blindfold, ain't what he see. Kids splashing, laughing, calling out his name. Bet he think it's just a swimming chain. Yeah. Marco Polo sailed seas at Kublai Khan. Now kids and pools got me feeling like a pawn. Exploring Asia, yeah, that's what he did. But played a game, sounded foolish with the lid. Marco Polo, yeah, the real OG. In a pool blindfold, ain't what he see. Kids splashing, laughing, calling out his name. Bet he think it's